to have this conversation. My name is Nsiki Nkize. I am a social entrepreneur. I run a business called Mentor, where we support female social entrepreneurs. I'm a speaker, MC, and for today, I will be your facilitator as we unpack this conversation and really figure out, where do we stand in what's currently happening from a global context. And with that, I'd like to go over to Dr. Richard and really just find out from you, from a geopolitics perspective, how do you think that will affect a just transition, I suppose globally, and then again specifically from an African context?
Thank you very much, Siki, and also to Dr. Amis and Dr. Otto. I mean, they've already laid the ground. The reality is that Africa is not an isolated continent, and Africa is not a country, and Africa is not adverse to the global challenges. Africa is part of the global community, and the countries are part of the global community. And so when the world sneezes, Africa will feel the pinch. The big question should really be where Africa is today has, before the crisis, whether we're talking crisis of droughts that are costing over 600 million livestock in the eastern part of Africa, or we're talking crisis of cyclones that we saw in 2019, and we still see Cyclone Nidai, Cyclone Kenneth, and we're talking about now drought again in East Africa. Then we talk COVID-19, which has already been alluded to. So Africa has been suffering from a barrage of different emergencies and calamities. And now then we're talking about the crisis, food crisis, energy crisis, and financial crisis. And the position of Africa today, it's a continent that is already suffering the climate crisis. It's not that Africa is going to suffer the climate crisis in 5 years. No, Africa is actually suffering the impacts of climate change today. We see children dying. We see these droughts, which are offshot of the changing climate. So the bigger question is, if you look at the discourse on just transition across the entire world, Africa's position and Africa's understanding of this needs to be juxtaposed within the contextual realities of the continent. 257 million brothers and sisters across the continent going to bed hungry. 620 million African citizens energy impoverished. And then on top of this, over 900 million depending on unclean cooking. So the just transition cannot be pitched from an energy transition as it's currently been seen across the entire world, because the emissions across the world, over 73% of them are as a result of energy usage. But at the same time, when you look at Africa, Africa only contributes up to about 4% of the global emission. It means Africa is actually a net positive, a net sink when it comes to emissions. And therefore, the discussion on just transition needs to center around one word in the African continent, which is socioeconomics. Why is Africa vulnerable to climate change? Because it has a very low socioeconomic base. People are unable to have the resources they're supposed to have. And resources here are not just in terms of money. People are unable to put food on the table. People are unable even to find jobs. The young people are actually getting 12 million into the labor market without this. And so when you put this within the context of socioeconomics, it therefore means that a just transition in Africa, as already said by Dr. Amis and Dr. Otto, it's about equity. It's about putting food on the table. It's about more money in more pockets. And unless we look at it from this perspective, then we'll be missing the bigger picture. And therefore, it boils down to the aspect of a narrative here. Narrative, there is profound power in a narrative. The just transition narrative in the African continent today needs to center around Africa's indigenous contextual understanding, which is 80% of the continent is actually in the informal sector. They are at the bottom of the pyramid. How do we lift them up? By ensuring that we utilize clean energy to add value to what they produce, by ensuring that we leverage nature-based approaches to grow food, but not only grow food, but grow food to add value, because we're currently losing food worth $48 billion US. And these contextual realities then shifts the discussion now to how can we leverage Africa's abundance to caution Africa against the shocks, because these emergencies and calamities will continue, whether it is the war in Ukraine and Russia, or it is drought that we're seeing, or it is floods and cyclones, or it is COVID-19. We will not stop emergencies, and we will continuously have these emergencies happening. But the big question that we need now is, how do we then climate-proof Africa so that it can be socio-economically viable, and at the same time lift people from the bottom of the pyramid?
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Richard. I think those are such valid points. And generally, I think when you look at Africa, the approach from a business perspective should be thinking about social entrepreneurship, social innovation, and social impact. And those should be key measures for any organization. And I do want to come back to you, Richard, just moving a little bit away from only talking about the just transition and understanding more, the impact of the current oil crisis, with the current global oil crisis, what does that mean for the climate change agenda as well as Africa's economic transition?
Thanks again, Nsiki, and thanks to Dr. Amis and Dr. Otto. The point is this: before I get to that, let's talk about the fundamentals here, because the reality is that you suffer from shocks based on your preparedness. If you are not prepared, you will continuously suffer from shocks. And if you externalize your development, definitely you are never ever going to cope with shocks. And shocks under the changing climate are going to be happening day in and day out, emergencies, as we are seeing today. So to build on that point, before I come to this impact of the geopolitics of these and climate change, is that you can only leverage from your position of strength. Africa is a continent with over 60% of its population being young people. Unless these young people are put at the center of transformational development, of transformational climate action, then definitely we are never ever going to have a just transition, because you have to retool their skills in such a way that they can be the ones to turn the cobalt and the lithium into solar batteries, into renewable energy systems. Unless you tap to start retooling their skills so that they are at the center of this discourse on climate action, then definitely we will never be able to make impact. Now back to the geopolitics. The reality is this. Progress. Currently, as we speak today, the crisis with oil increases have been peaked, and it's currently being discussed that is an opportunity for Africa. Well, it's a blessing and it's a curse. If you look at the start of the crisis, especially increases in oil prices, Africa have exporters and importers. But when you look at the importers, these have actually costed the African continent up to $19 billion US, resulting in inflation as we speak today, 12.2%. But there are exporters. They have not benefited. Why? Because they do not have the refinery systems within the continent to be able to add value to oil. So they export raw material, exporting employment and importing unemployment. Now let's come to food. The food in the continent today, Africa have 65% of uncultivated arable land. But what is happening? It's importing food above $35 billion US, importing unemployment and exporting employment. It then means that Africa is not prepared. And I'm trying to bring this before I answer your question, because if we do not have the fundamentals of what makes economic transformation under emergencies right, no matter what we do, we might not be able to survive the changing climate. Why do I say so? A continent today, food crisis resulting in high inflation because of importation, yet there is no discussion on how do we leverage clean energy abundance, which Africa have 65% of the best solar resource in the entire world. But it's only having 1% of solar penetration across the entire African continent. There is something fundamentally wrong. And when we're talking about energy here, it's not just about lighting. We need to move from energy as providing light to homes in the continent to energy as a competitive resource to add value to agricultural produce, so that at least we can start to add value, package, and sell across the entire African continent. But as we speak today, that is not the case. So when you look at the geopolitics of what is happening vis-a-vis the changing climate, before the increase in oil prices, before the increase in food prices, the African continent citizenry was already vulnerable to the changing climate. And as I said earlier, why? Because they have a very low socio-economic base. They cannot put food on the table. They cannot put more money in more pockets. And if I give a very practical example, cyclones are hitting the Western world every day. In the United States, when cyclones and hurricanes hit, what happens? Very few people lose their life. Though a life lost anywhere across the world is far too many. But when it hits in Africa, what happened? People lose their lives and property is destroyed because the people cannot even afford insurance. How do you get insurance when you cannot be able to put more money in your pockets to then be able to afford to buy that insurance? It therefore means everything we say must center around socioeconomics. People need more food on the table and more money in more pockets. And now that takes me to a very important point on climatepreneurship. Climatepreneurship now, with the geopolitics, is how do we ensure that our young people who are getting to the labor market, 12 million of them, competing with fewer jobs, start to create jobs within the challenges that we face today, because a challenge or a crisis should not be wasted. And we keep wasted COVID crisis. Now we're wasting this crisis. Across the continent, 84% of the entire population is in rural areas and they're energy impoverished. They don't have access to energy. Grid electricity is not going to reach them. If you are told that grid electricity is going to reach them, that's a lie. We need off-grid and mini-grid to be able to reach them. Who are those who are supposed to be intervening in this? Young people. We have a continent today where over 900 million of the entire population is depending on clean cooking. They depend on charcoal. But simple turning agricultural waste into fuel briquettes replaces charcoal and can tap into a 20 billion market that is currently not even tapped as we speak today. That is where entrepreneurship, climatepreneurship opportunities can be created. But this is what needs to be done. We need governments at the moment to be able to put policy incentives, especially fiscal incentives like tax breaks and tax incentives. We are seeing this happening across most countries where value-added tax, especially in Kenya in their finance bill of 2001, remove value-added tax on fuel briquettes, on burgers, and this is an opportunity for you to start developing their enterprises. This should become the norm and not the exception. We are talking about today about energy, and there is the narrative, and I'll go back to what I said. There is a narrative that, okay, Africa have oil, Africa have gas, it should be exploited. The question is, we're not even talking about how much it takes to build one liquid natural gas terminal, 25 billion US dollars. But the International Energy Agency showed that 25 billion US dollar invested over 10 years can help the continent for everybody to have access to clean electricity. But then the discussion is, yes, let's tap gas, let's just transition by tapping gas. We're not talking about the finance. And as we're speaking today, African countries, over 77% of them are actually having their debt to GDP at above 77. It means most of them are in economic distress. How do you then engage yourself in debt when there are low-hanging fruits of turning waste to biogas that can help mothers in communities have clean cooking gas, and in the course of doing that, youth tool are retool, or turn agricultural waste into fuel briquettes that can help them replace charcoal, and you are not only going to reduce indoor pollution, but you will create opportunities. So within the climate space, it's about socio-economic. It's about doing that, which then works with nature, not against nature, but at the same time help young people to put more money in their pockets. And that is the kind of narrative we need now. And that's what we are doing, leveraging on this spirit of innovative volunteerism, as Moy said.
Thank you. No, I think there's a lot of opportunities there that you have spoken to, and a lot of opportunities also presented by the different crises that exist. You know, that yes, there's a challenge, but business exists in the space of being able to resolve those challenges. Dr. Richard, you spoke about shocks that are presented, and the fact that, we really aren't well equipped to deal with those shocks. So I'm curious to find out from you, how do African countries begin to build resilient economies, resilient societies, and what are some of the mechanisms we should consider in building up that resilience?
The first is we must be able to leverage our climate army, which are our youth, to be the solution providers to the challenges we're facing by turning climate challenge into climate opportunity. Very simple. What do we need to do? We need to ensure that we start to retool, to put centers in place. Of course, the Africa Green Economy Center for Green Economy is already doing excellent work. Can we be able to build on these institutions across the continent, to build on what they're doing without reinventing the wheel? Can we be able to build on young people whom we are seeing across the continent already turning agricultural waste into fuel briquettes, into biogas, into turning solar dryers that are helping decentralize to communities, solar models? We need to build their skills and capacitate them so that they become the climate army actors that can turn climate challenges into opportunity. That is one. Two, Africa is a leader when it comes to climate change. And the leadership is at policy level. If you look across the entire world, Africa is the only continent in the world that have ratified the Paris Agreement more than any other. 53 countries out of 54 ratified. But unfortunately, policy implementation is the biggest problem. Out of the 53, only about 20% of those have turned their nationally determined contribution into investment plans. It means that we're talking almost about 80% that are not doing it. How will investors come in to invest in those areas? It means we'll still talk about these issues 10 years from now. But what needs to be done at the moment goes back to what I said. Policy and fiscal incentive. It is not government that implement. It's ordinary citizens, especially the young people, but they need the enabling environment. And one of the enabling environments is to put policy incentive, but we need to start considering structures that we're not talking about. Communal cooperatives. Communal cooperatives are structures that are found in every community, so that resources are actually channeled through them, so that the informal sector and those who do not have access to formal banks to be able to access credit can start accessing credit. And what government needs to do is to leverage what is called a de-risking scheme. That is, if government have 50 billion US dollars or 20 billion US dollars, they should then be able to map out microfinancing institutions and actually give them this money so that at least they can be able to loan at very low interest rate to those who are carrying out climate action initiatives across the country so that at least they can build their resilience. The last part, which to me is the most important part, is what I started with. The narrative of liability that has somehow been perfected across the continent needs to stop. Climate change is an investment opportunity. It is not a liability as it's currently been projected. And we need to start communicating the opportunity that climate change presents. And we need to start to inspire our young people so that at least they can start to create and diversify to create climate and enterprises so that at least they can diversify their income even if they have alternative jobs. That then means we must ensure that climate entrepreneurship become part and parcel of educational curriculum in every school across the entire continent. Because when this is put within the vision of national development, each and everyone will start to know, yes, this is what I can do, and I can make more money. And collectively, we will turbocharge and bring impact to scale in a very short time. Over.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Richard. There's a comment here from Robert Ngedi saying that just transition based on unlocking inclusive socioeconomics provides an opportunity for Africa to buffer against geopolitical emergencies. And I think just to your point around educating the youth, that if we have more young people who do become part of that climate army, but also become those climatepreneurs, that we can really take advantage of the opportunities that exist. And I think in addition to that is also looking at the investment instruments and financing instruments that do exist and that are made available, making sure that as young people wanting to access the space, that the support, the necessary support is there and it does exist from various institutions, not just from government. And I say that being a young person who at the moment is farming garlic, and that's a bootstrapping operation, and to scale that for what I'm looking at next year, there's just no way I can afford it by myself. And on the other hand, bringing in solar power substitutes as another business thing that we're exploring really does require financial backing. And I think a lot of young people might find that difficult. So I think a key thing in this conversation as well is that if we're putting in those buffers and those various mechanisms and encouraging young people to participate, that the structures that exist should also support that transition as well. There's a question here that came through from Res. Kanju, hi Res. And I think I'll pose this to Dr. Richard. It's also a statement, but I think maybe Dr. Richard, you could speak to, is there a power vacuum that exists and who comes into it? So Res says, at the heart of a just transition is the imperative of social dialogue. Platforms of dialogue and sectors of society are either polarized or influenced by political ideologies and agendas. Therefore, the pursuit for a just transition can be derailed or delayed based on political interests of the time. Political forces thrive or fail on the basis of social demand. So maybe, Richard, if you can maybe just speak to that a little bit to say, how do we navigate that, especially as so many African countries do have a very tense political landscape. Over to you, Dr.
Thank you very much. And I think Dr. Emis has put it very rightly and very nicely. Sometimes, let me be a little bit frank and very, very, a little brutal here. There is always this question, who is going to do it for us? We are going to do it for ourselves. The attitude that people have to do things for the continent has been a false narrative and has actually led the continent down a path that we are still struggling to find a narrative that suits context. And I think this is very, very dangerous. And when we have an opportunity anywhere to speak about this, we should speak about it without any fear of contradiction. I started off by saying there is profound power in the narrative. And when people are asking who is going to position the continent so that at least we can have a narrative that fits, it is us, especially the young people. The young people, I have argued this. Of course, I'm a fan of the young people. I believe that there can be no transformational development, especially transformational climate action solutions across the continent, without the young people taking charge. And that is why we focus on them. But this is the point I want to bring. We are now in a crisis. Before this crisis, there was a COVID crisis. And the question has always been, we don't have money. You will never have money enough to do what is needed. Take that to the bank. Number two is, you will never be able to do something thinking that you will be applauded for elsewhere. You have to do what is needed within your community and within your country to solve a problem that faces our mothers, our brothers and sisters each and every day. Indoor pollution kills over 700,000 Africans. These are not mere statistics. We have 257 million Africans who go to bed hungry with a stomach aching of hunger. These are brothers and sisters. These are realities that are supposed to make us emotional, not emotional to cry, but emotional to take action. And now back to the point. The reality is this. When you look across the entire African continent today, and I said this, but I will repeat it because it's important. The food prices that have resulted to inflation, we are discussing a continent that is importing wheat. 50% of wheat is imported into the continent, depreciating national reserves and importing food that could be produced. I have not seen and I have not heard a single youth forum, and I stand corrected if there is, discussing cassava, which is a climate resilient crop that produces up to 300 products that can be consumed by over 500 million across the continent. The discussion is only blame game and blame game. Am I trying to say that young people are not doing right? They're doing excellent, amazing work across the continent. But I think that the capitalization on success stories has been missing. We capitalize on our weaknesses. And let me just say this. When you capitalize on your weakness, you can never be able to make progress, because the reality is that the world is a competitive space. And what matters is strength. What matters is value. If you do not bring value to the table to negotiate with from your position of strength, you lose. That's the reality. And just to add to what Dr. Emi said, look, when you look at the discussion on gas in the continent today, on fossil fuels, there is a hidden narrative that, at least let us be clear. I brought this up and I'll repeat it again. To build just one liquid natural plant costs 25 billion US dollars. How many countries can afford that? Already, countries in the continent today are having a debt ratio of 77% to GDP. Debt to GDP ratio of 77%. You will take a loan to increase that debt, and who's going to pay for it? And how many people are going to benefit as a result of exploiting fossil fuel? I said 84% of the entire African continent is in rural areas. You cannot reach them through grid, because data shows that to develop grid per person in a urban area costs $500, but in rural area costs $2,300. So you're talking over 360%. These realities are not communicated, and therefore the profound power of a narrative needs an urgency of now by us to start debunking these myths, which sometimes mislead policy making, and at the same time also make our young people to think that things can be done differently, even when we do not recognize the reality in which we are in today. And just one last point, we need a reimagination. A reimagination, because I'm saying this because Albert Einstein said, if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live all its life thinking it can never be able to climb a tree. That is what we are given sometimes, to think that we cannot do it. But when we have solutions in front of our eyes every day, who told us not to go to YouTube to learn how to turn agricultural waste into briquettes? Well, we use social media, which is a blessing in disguise, to communicate falsehood, to blame one another. And so why I'm bringing up these things is that we cannot be able to talk about just transition and transformational development under the changing climate without talking about soft aspects, which is an urgency to change mindsets and to start telling our young people there are lies and falsehood, sometimes on issues that will never work. But what can work is forgotten and is not discussed, but which is what is needed. Over.
Thank you, Dr. Richard. I think that's such a great point that, you'll never have enough money to do it, but if you don't get started, you'll never actually do it. And then to you, Dr. Richard, how will the outcomes of COP27 be affected by the current oil crisis? So if you could each just give me a quick one-liner, and so we can still try to wrap up in time. Over to you, Dr. Richard.
Well, I will end up with this African proverb that there are no shortcuts to the top of the palm tree. Yes, there are no shortcuts. The realities of Africans will be solved by Africans contextualizing solutions to the challenges we face as a continent. And those solutions should be climate action solutions, so that at least we can build resilience to put more money in more pockets and food on the table. The second is the narrative must be contextualized. The truth is that it's not the first COP that is held in the continent. In 2006, COP was held in Kenya here. In 2011, COP was held in South Africa in Durban. So this is not the first time COP in the continent. And because COP will come for 2-3 weeks in the continent, the problems of Africa will not be solved in 3 weeks. What does it mean? We must be able to take charge and become responsible, because leadership is personal responsibility. If countries have already put in place their climate action plan, let's each and every one of us look into that and say, what can I, from an entrepreneurship perspective, start to do with what I have? And then use the data from that to then say to government, look, we need incentives here. We need tax break here. We need support here. Because the reality is, externalizing solutions is the biggest risk to any system. And we have been externalizing solutions. And the last part, which I think I said it before, we must be able to shun away from these false narratives and start contextualizing narratives that build on what works and leverage what works in the continent, and start believing in ourselves. If we do not do that, the changing climate will continuously expose the continent and actually derail development and plunge millions of people into suffering. That's something we should not allow, because our youth are actually the solutions that we need today. But let's inspire them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's a comment here from Christopher saying a wonderful conversation. And I think really that's a really good summarization of this discussion. It has been a very good conversation. And I'm sure there's a lot more that can be unpacked, that we could sit for an hour and just discuss just transition. We could sit for an hour and just discuss the various entrepreneurial opportunities that exist. We can sit and talk about the financial interventions. There's so many things that we can unpack that become offshoots from this discussion. But I think really just being here and having this conversation, just setting the context of, where are we in terms of geopolitics and just transition, and giving everybody something to think about was really fantastic. So to all of my panelists, Dr. Mayo Amos, to Dr. Richard Munang, and to Dr. Arthur, I'm going to try to say this correctly, Baino Mugisha, which I hope I did. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and you sharing your insights with us.